Memes is commenting here. It seems too often amazing discoveries go years without being picked up by a particular community. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are, it's complicated how, in order for a discovery to get picked up, there has to be sort of a conceptual framework and to some extent a kind of social framework that that discovery can fit into. So, there are things that people notice, things I've discovered in my time, for example, where I realized there were sort of precursors of those things from 100, 200 years earlier, but there was no framework into which to fit those things. Yes, the digits of pi look kind of random, but so what? Well, eventually you get this whole framework where you think about the generation of complexity by computational processes, and then that starts to fit in and be something that's interesting. But earlier than that, it was just sort of a random fact that didn't seem to fit in anywhere. You need these kind of frameworks to kind of support having sort of things that were as a point thing discovered much earlier. I have to say there are different dynamics of sort of things that got discovered and then didn't really get picked up. I mean, neural nets are a great example, invented in 1943 or so, but finally sort of really, really picked up in the last decade or so. That was an unusual case, because I think that was a case where sort of the conceptual framework kind of existed, but one needed practical technology tools to really make something out of this idea. It's sort of unusual because the most common situation tends to be you don't even know that it's a thing until you have some of the tools necessary to study it. And by the time you have those tools, you can build a framework and you can start to sort of integrate things. But yeah, there are lots of examples of where things were sort of discovered ahead of their time, often as isolated facts, and not really picked up. Now, it's confusing when one studies the history of science, because there's a certain tendency, once one understands something in today's terms, in the framework that's been built up, you go back and look and you say, wait a minute, those squiggles that somebody wrote down 1,000 years ago, they remind me of what I now know and what I now understand in this framework. Really, this was discovered 1,000 years ago, because look at that squiggle. And you'd probably be wrong. And probably, if you went back and talked to the person who made that squiggle, and said to them, hey, we've got this modern thing and it works this way, they'd look blankly at you, and because they wouldn't know that modern framework. But even if you go back and sort of probe what they were thinking when they wrote that squiggle, it will be something pretty far distant from what one has in sort of modern times. I mean, this question of sort of communicating ideas across history is a difficult one. And there are ideas that are rather straightforward to communicate. They're things where we've built a tower where we go back and we look, and the tower we built really had the things that were there, let's say axioms from Euclid or something, as bricks in that tower. And there are also places where one looks back and the things one can see are features of human nature, where we can understand them because human nature back in ancient Greek times is no different from human nature today, so far as we can tell. And so that's another place where you can, have that kind of understanding. But when it comes to, I don't know, some thing about computation, where you might say, well, there's sort of an ancient Greek analog of this, let's try to go back and explain that. I mean, like, for example, I don't know, Heraclitus was big on the sort of everything is flow. There is nothing unless there is change, so to speak. I realized recently our modern theory of how space works, physical space works, is just like that. There are all these sort of, we call them eames, these atoms of space, and the way in which there are relations between those atoms of space, the way in which those relations sort of come to exist is by virtue of events that change these atoms of space in ways that are correlated with other atoms of space. So in other words, space wouldn't be a thing. It wouldn't be knitted together as a thing were it not for this sort of continual process of change. But I sort of imagine going back to old Heraclitus and explaining to him the kind of theory that we have now about causal graphs and these slices of causal graphs that make hypergraphs that limit to the structure of space and so on. And the question is, his statement, everything is change, there is nothing without change, so to speak. Could one really have made the connection between these modern ideas and what Heraclitus was talking about? Or is there really sort of an irreducible distance between those kinds of sets of ideas? I'm not sure. I kind of tend to think that there's a fairly irreducible distance, and that it isn't that, you're sort of, you can take the modern idea and you can back project and say, it's cool that there's something that sort of was a shadow of that idea that existed long ago, but in some sense, it wasn't really the same idea. When you ask of a modern idea, can one build a tower on top of that idea? And if the answer is yes, for that idea, but then you go back and say, well, could Heraclitus have built that tower on the basis of what he was talking about? And the answer is no. Then you have to kind of think, well, it isn't really the same idea in some sense.